everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is I'm the Director of Artistic Administration for Wolfpack Opera, and I'm really thrilled that you all came for our first event in our Lucretia Project, which is a new initiative for us, and I'm just thrilled to see you all here. Thanks for coming. When we started looking at The Rape of Lucretia by Benjamin Britten as one of the pieces for our repertoire, we were struck not only by the beauty of the piece, but the richness of the story, and wanted to find ways to tell the story and look into all of these different aspects. So in order to do that, we've created this series of events that we've titled the Lucretia Project that delve into the artwork created around the story, the different written versions of the story, the different music created around the story, and then also the telling of looking into the social issues that this story brings up, both in its original time period and that are still active today. I'm thrilled to partner with the McLean Project for the Arts on this endeavor this evening. We are presenting a talk by the Assistant Curator of Northern Baroque Paintings at the National Gallery, Dr. Alexandra Libby. She has written numerous articles, presented at conferences related to Dutch and Flemish art. Her most recent published article was published in Historians of Netherlandish Art. The title, Solomonic Ambitions of Isabel Claret Eugenia in Rubens' Triumph of the Eucharist Tapestry Series. And you'll have to tell us a little bit more about that too. She got her master's from Boston University and her PhD in art and the history of art and architecture at the University of Maryland. She's going to talk to us about the Lucretia story and its representation in visual art this evening. I present to you Dr. Alexandra Libby.
Thank you, Leanne, for the warm introduction and for inviting me here this evening to speak about Lucretia in art as part of this Lucretia project. First of all, can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, good. I was a kindergarten teacher in a previous life, so I learned to project them, but usually about taking your finger out of your nose. So the story of Lucretia, as you all know so well, is dramatic, it's tragic. Tells the story of one woman's self-sacrifice following her brutal violation, the consequences of which would incite a rebellion that would overthrow a tyranny. And it comes to us from Libby, his ancient history of Rome. Oh, I forgot to turn it on. Sorry. I should. Okay. Libby's Ancient History of Rome, which he wrote starting around 25 BC, and he died around 12 AD, just to give you the time frame. And this is a 142-book series, only about 25 of which survive today. And these books attempted to narrate and glorify the history of the Roman civilization over nearly 8 centuries, from the time of Romulus and Remus to the reign of Tiberius. And what you have to remember about Libby is that he was a storyteller. He was a novelist, an orator, a dramatist. So the stories that come from this history are usually extremely colorful. In the centuries that followed the rise and fall of the Roman Republic, works like Libby's really fell out of favor as communities became much more intensely and inwardly religious looking, and I'm talking about like the Middle Ages here. But during the Renaissance and later Baroque periods, his work experienced an enormous revival. And the popularity of his work during this time frame, and now I'm talking about the 15th through 17th centuries, is what I'd like to spend a little time tonight discussing, just to provide a little historical context for the staging of The Rape of Lucretia, which will happen in just a few weeks, if not next week. My area of specialization at the National Gallery is, as Leanne said, 17th century Dutch and Flemish paintings, so Vermeer, Rembrandt, Rubens, all of those guys. So I'll talk more about some of the representations of that story that come out of that period. However, the origins of the dramatic revival of The Rape of Lucretia and Libby really date to the Italian Renaissance. And this is a time during which artists, poets, playwrights, scholars rediscovered classical antiquity. Renaissance, for all of you French speakers, Renaissance, literally means rebirth, and refers specifically to the rebirth of Greco-Roman antiquity. And this is in part because as wealthy patrons are building their villas in Rome, they are literally unearthing sculpture. And you may know the story of this very famous Roman villa, a Roman sculptural grouping called the Laocoon. I don't know if many of you know this. That was unearthed in 1506 in the vineyard of this very wealthy man, Felice Giuffredis. And Michelangelo was called to the villa to watch it being dug out. And so what you see in art is that he, in the Sistine ceiling, for example, uses this composition. And I won't really linger here because this is totally irrelevant to what I'm talking about. But I thought you might recognize this image. So in any case, the rebirth of antiquity also occurred at this time because it was perceived to have been a more perfect civilization with the greatest understanding of, among other things, the arts and humanities. These, it was reasoned, had declined during the so-called Middle Ages that stretched between the end of antiquity and their own time, so, about 1,000 years. But by emulating exemplary works from the ancients, contemporary artists, scholars, they might restore art, and therefore civilization, to its former grandeur. And this necessitated copying works from the ancients, as well as reviving their poetry, their dramas, music, literature. So this brings us to Livy, who is one of the ancient authors that gets caught up in this rediscovery, and his works become highly sought after. And there developed this huge rush to collect and preserve his manuscripts that went as high up as the Pope, who's sending his mandate that we must build these libraries devoted to ancient literature. And part and parcel of this popularity thus becomes representations in the visual arts of episodes from his history, including the rape of Lucretia. And here on the screen is a version at the Mount Holyoke Art Museum. So I'll just go over the story quickly. It takes place during the tyrannical rule of Tarquinius Superbus in Rome in the 6th century BC. While away during the siege of Ardea, Lucretia's husband, Colantinus, boasts that her loyalty and virtue are greater than that of his compatriots' wives. So taking up the challenge, the men at camp ride immediately to Rome, where they discover Lucretia alone with her handmaidens, spinning wool while the other wives are doing something frivolous and frugal and, I don't know, just enjoying leisure. Lucretia's very virtue, however, inflames the desires of Tarquinius' son, Sextus Tarquinius, who then returns a few days later, and having been received previously as an honored guest, he steals secretly to her bedchamber, draws his sword, and threatens to kill her if she doesn't yield to him. She resists, but when Sextus Tarquinius threatens to kill his own slave as well, and then place their naked bodies together to give the appearance that they had been killed in the act of adultery, she yields to his demands rather than die in such disgrace. The next day, Lucretia summons her father and husband to her side and relates what happened, stressing that only her body had been violated, not her heart. And despite their protestations of her innocence, she is determined to make the moral choice that has been forced upon her, saying, "Never shall Lucretia provide a precedent for unchaste women to escape what they deserve." And Livy relates that with these words, Lucretia draws a sword from under her robes, drives it into her heart, and falls forward dead. Overwhelmed by grief, Lucretia's father, her husband, and 2 accompanying friends swear to avenge her death, and her suicide helps rouse the anger of the populace against the tyrannical rule of Tarquinius Superbus, who is then forced into exile. Sextus Tarquinius is also driven from Rome and is assassinated shortly thereafter. So, in Livy's account, Lucretia embodied chastity. Right? She's canonized for dying rather than living as a defiled woman. And because of this, during the Renaissance, some of the earliest representations we see of Lucretia is on Italian wedding chests called cassoni, and also on panels that decorated bedrooms called spalieri, as her self-sacrifice was the ultimate validation of chastity, and thereby reminded women that their chastity was a virtue which reflected not only on themselves, but also on their families, particularly their husbands. And I guess I should make probably one clarification about the word rape at this time. which is that it was understood in totally different terms. It wasn't so much about the brutal violation of a woman and her right to her own body. It was really a violation of sexual sanctity that reflected poorly on the honor of the household. So, for example, in the lower echelons, rape was taken much less seriously. It was really only at the higher aristocratic level where it wasn't considered adultery, basically. It was a much graver, for instance, since Lucretia, in Libby's account, was a respected upper-class Roman woman, her rape would have been viewed as particularly reprehensible. So here I'm showing you the center panel of a cassone, a wedding chest, from about 1465. And what you can see is through represented architecture, the artist has divided this panel into three scenes, three narrative scenes. The rape, Lucretia's confession, and then the expulsion of the Tarquins. And so in the scene farthest to the left, the rape, we see Sextus Tarquinius with his dagger drawn, threatening Lucretia. And next to him is his slave, right here. Which is interesting because the artist has chosen to interpret slave as black, probably meaning a Moor. And it's interesting because the text doesn't explicitly state anything about ethnicity. So the racialization of the figure is really meant to infer for the contemporary Renaissance audience the ultimate humiliation. She would not only be dishonored by the false adultery represented by the spectacle of their joined corpses, but she would basically be further contaminated by this presumed sexual contact with an other, right, with a racial other. Then juxtaposed to the rape scene is Lucretia's declaration of the rape to her husband and father, but also notably in front of another woman, which is, again, it's interesting that she has among her this female audience, again, not specified in the text. And then in the last scene, you see the forced exile of Tarquinius Superbus and his rapist son, Sextus Tarquinius. So why put this on a wedding chest? Probably because within the context of marriage, her fate served as an exemplar both to husband and wife, emphasizing a woman's need for stoic honesty and virtue, and underlying a man's responsibility to defend the honor of his family and state. On a Spalgari, slightly later, that's at the Gardner Museum in Boston by Botticelli, we see a similar message, though articulated in a slightly different way. Here he's again used the architecture to divide this into three separate scenes. On the left here, you see Sextus Tarquinius threatening Lucretia. To the right, you have her husband and kinsman rushing to support her falling body at the moment of her death. And then at the center, here is her body laid out on the funeral bier. While above her, Brutus, who is one of the men who swears vengeance, raises his sword and exhorts his fellow Romans to revenge. So here what we see is less of an emphasis on Lucretia's agency as previous, where we saw her telling her kinsman to avenge her. Instead, Botticelli highlights her body, and the men become much more front and center in this representation as heroes who ultimately carry out the rebellion that leads to the formation of the Roman Republic. So it's a subtle difference, but it's definitely there. And again, why? Well, for the Renaissance woman, there was no virtue more important than chastity. And this encompassed not only sexual purity, but also modesty and good behavior, proper behavior. Italian Renaissance society was highly patriarchal and placed enormous emphasis on lineage. So concerns about the legitimacy of offspring played a really key role in the valorization of chastity. Moreover, social practices that ensured maintenance of chastity meant relegating women to a private, defined social existence, not highly public, not very vocal, certainly not the kind of vocal, proclamatory interactions that we saw in the Mount Holyoke panel. And I just want to stop here to remind reiterate that these were for a very private space, that these were for a woman's bedroom. Spalieri often hung above the bed, Cassoni might be near the bed, at the edge of the bed, in the room. So these were messages for women to be looked at and to be contemplated within their domestic sphere. So how did the story play out in a more patriarchal place? Perhaps not surprisingly, a little different. And that's because despite this interest in protecting their wives and daughters and in keeping them within this socially acceptable realm, they were also interested in enjoying women as sexual beings. So here I show you Lucas Cranach's Lucretia of about 1530, depicted semi-nude, alone. Her only attribute that really defines her as Lucretia is the knife, which of course recalls her rape and announces her impending death. And Cranach, of all of the secular subjects that he painted, he did Lucretia the most. He painted over 40 scenes of Lucretia, and nearly all of them look something like this. Many of them are half-length or full-length with a view through a window. Almost all, if not completely nude, semi-nude. In some, she's even paired with a Venus, so that you know that she embodies a certain kind of love, which is to say chaste love. And in this image, Lucretia's patrician status is clearly evident by her sumptuous attire, her rich clothes, jewelry, her fur-lined robe. And that fur-lined robe, interestingly, was also often worn by Venetian courtesans. So this is part of a different kind of iconography also. And here's some other versions by Cranach. And in almost each of them, she's always contemplating the act of suicide. Her dagger has never really drawn blood. So in Lucretia, Cranach really combines the idea of brutal death of a chaste, virtuous heroine with this sort of erotic sensuality, and even with imagery known specifically through courtesan culture. I would like to say that this painting, which I started out with today, still hangs in the king's dressing room at Windsor Castle. So this is still very much part of a male viewing experience. Then you have Titian, one of Titian's most famous representations of this scene, which is at the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge. You see, he chooses the moment that Lucretia submits. He focuses on her nudity with this very strategically placed linen that's just falling down, pillows that are propping her up just so, her incredibly fleshy form, the isolation of the scene in the very private sphere of her bed. Titian painted this image for King Philip II of Spain, who hung it in his private apartments along with several other works by Titian, including Venus and Adonis and Danae, which are still in Madrid, and also the Rape of Europa, which is in the Gardner Museum, and then one other image of Venus that's now lost. So again, this hung in a context of other paintings with highly erotic subjects, or at least overt ones. And in fact, there are records from King's courtiers that talk about when the Queen came to visit his private apartments, they covered up all of these paintings because they were just too sexy. So we know that Lucretia was very much part of this context of titillation, right, of excitement. And you see this even more so in 17th century images, specifically in Italian 17th century images, where Lucretia's eyes turn upward as if she's in this ecstatic rapture, as in this image by Francesco Cairo, or this other unknown Italian Baroque painter. This is a highly eroticized experience of death. The heroine is beautiful, she's seductive, and the artist has put considerable attention on her lush drapery and her white chemise, which falls just low enough here so that you see her nipple. She looks up as if she is not only not suffering, she might even be enjoying this moment, right? Her parted lips, her upturned eyes, this elevated state of rapture. And with these paintings, we don't know specifically who they were for, but I think we can guess that these movies were not for women. So, what happens when we turn our attention north in the 17th century, specifically the Netherlands? Images of Lucretia play out a little differently. And here I'm showing you one such representation by Rembrandt, which is at the National Gallery, so you can all come see it in much more beautiful image than this slide sometime soon. And it takes you about 1664. So here you see really a moment of inner anguish, right? Here she is standing with her arms outstretched just prior to this act of suicide. And Rembrandt he intensifies the tragedy of this impending suicide. In the contrast he develops between her extremely elegant attire, the poignancy of her gestures and expressions. Here she is incredibly richly adorned. She has a diadem, pearl earrings, this pearl necklace, a chain with a gold pendant. And then you have a teardrop pearl hanging from it. She is an incredibly regal figure. Her golden dress with the cape that falls over her outstretched arms, it adds this extraordinary splendor again that is so evident when you stand in front of the painting. But he's arranged her robes so that you also have the sense of vulnerability, right? The clasps that hook her bodice here are hanging open. Her dress is parted, her chest is covered only by the white chemise that really fits her so gracefully, but she's about to thrust this dagger into her heart. And again, when you stand in front of the painting, this expression on her face is so incredibly sorrowful. Her eyes have he placed just the slightest hint of red so that they look almost bloodshot. I mean, this is an incredibly devastating moment, right? She holds her left hand open at the same height as the right, as though part of her is sort of resisting the contemplation of this act. And the tension surrounding this awful moment really emphasizes the human drama of a woman caught in the moral dilemma of choosing between life and honor, a choice that would take on enormously symbolic connotations. So the human drama, right? This is very different. This is a different kind of painting than I've shown you already this evening. It's about the act about to take place, not about her nudity, not about the violence of a dagger being plunged into her chest or some sort of perversely sexual enjoyment of suicide. Rembrandt reveals the essence of Lucretia as a moral and also mortal being interested in the consequences of her actions as a precedent for later generations. So one reason that this painting is so different in the Netherlands is that in the North, Lucretia's tragedy assumed a lot of political dimensions. Her rape came to symbolize the tyrannical subjugation of the city by Tarquinius Superbus and his family, and it was ultimately that rape that triggered the revolt that led to the overthrow of the tyranny and the creation of political freedom in the form of a republican government. So this really resonated in the northern Netherlands. Since the 15th century, the northern Netherlands had been part of the Habsburg Empire, and they were ruled specifically by the Spanish Habsburgs. They had Habsburg governors who were dictating all of their policies and tax laws, and also their religious codes. So the Habsburgs were very Catholic, and in the north there was the infiltration of Protestantism. So then, beginning in the mid-16th century, in the north, they instigated a rebellion that would last for 80 years, in which they struggled for and ultimately gained independence from their Habsburg rulers. And Roman heroes who sought to free themselves from unjust rule became a major touchstone for the Dutch, who really saw themselves as the contemporary, sort of taking up the contemporary torch of that struggle. So you see a lot in the literature of that time, these parallels that they make with themselves and with Roman heroes, or even pre-Roman heroes. Basically any underdog civilization that is fighting against, as I said, unjust rule specifically. And so one of the earliest, and I'll show you some detail, and most conspicuous appearances of Lucretia as a patriot in the 17th century is found in a print by Claes Fischer from 1609. And this depicts the stage performances on May 5th, 1609 by the Amsterdam rhetoricians. And it's the performances that celebrated the 12 years truce. So this was a truce that lasted from 1609 to 1621. There was a temporary ceasefire between the Habsburgs and the Dutch, but what was really remarkable about it is that during that ceasefire, the rights of the Dutch to practice as Protestants and to function as an independent nation, basically with their own emissaries, with their own minor court system, were recognized. So this was a major step in the ultimate independence that they gained and formed as the Dutch Republic. And so the print that was made after the performances that were staged at this moment that celebrates that shows the story of Lucretia. And so you see the stage is depicted in the center panel. Here the people gathering to watch, and then you see these 10 smaller scenes around that are showing these separate performances. And the prints begin with a description in the upper left-hand corner of the rule of the Tarquins, the oppressors of the Romans, and the final print ends with the triumphant rule of Brutus. And in between, we see scenes of the rebellion of the Romans against the Tarquins, central to which, of course, is the story of Lucretia. And so those we see in scenes 4, 5, and 6. So in scene 4, up here, this is Lucretia's rape, and you see Sextus Tarquinius holding the dagger to her. And if you know, both are fully dressed in elaborate costumes. That's important, she is not nude. And the accompanying text reads, "The sanctity that Lucretia devoted to her husband, Sextus the king's son plundered from mad passion and envy." So you see these little descriptions that tell you what's going on here. Then in the 5th scene, we see Lucretia standing unadorned on stage, surrounded by soldiers. She's raised her dagger to herself while the soldiers are trying to stop her. And then the text above, reading, "Of Lucretia's fidelity, testimonies endure, her blood for her husband and her spirit for the gods." Then you have the last one, number 6, which shows her suicide. And the stage is crowded with officials who are leaning over her slumped body, and 3 men raise their right arms in what appears to be an oath of vengeance. So you have those guys right here. And that text reads, "Lucretia's disaster so upset the oppressed people that the king renounced on Brutus's demand." So in short, the act of her suicide precipitated the downfall of the Tarquins. Early 17th century Dutch paintings that focus on Lucretia as a patriot share with Fischer's early print the inclusion and emphasis of the role of Brutus. And Arnold Houbraken did a well-known painting that is now lost, but is known through a print after the painting. So that's what I'm showing you. And what we see is the moment just after Lucretia's death, with the focus on the men swearing vengeance. So Lucretia's lying on the ground with her feet in a sort of contrast, really, between the ideas of active and passive. So, what we're finding is, again, the idea of patriotism as really reigning supreme in these northern representations. And by the mid-century, when the most famous of the Dutch Baroque painters, Rembrandt, takes up the subject, this is a very well-established association. Not only in the visual culture, but there's also an extraordinary amount of literature that addresses the positive morality of her sacrifice. Literature, plays, even poems appear at this unprecedented rate, including, there's a poem written by this Dutchman, Jan Vos, in 1660, about a painting of Lucretia by one of Rembrandt's pupils, Clovert Flink. And in this poem, he writes, "In the red ink of her blood, she writes a definition of freedom." So that's even one of Rembrandt's pupils in a poem's related. So this is very much very much the ambiance of this image at this time. Of course, what you see with Rembrandt, as you know, with Rembrandt forever, is that it's unlike anything we have yet seen. Rembrandt painted at least 3 images of Lucretia, only 2 of which survive ours at the National Gallery, and then one that's in Minneapolis. And in the gallery's haunting image, Rembrandt has evoked both Lucretia's profound sadness and her resignation, right, to the fate, that has been forced upon her. In the Minneapolis version, he has portrayed Lucretia just after she has stabbed herself. You see her chemise is already stained with blood. And the 2 images really complement each other, not only because their compositions and painterly qualities are so similar, but also because they explore Lucretia's emotions as she readies herself prior to her self-sacrifice, and then as she responds to the consequences of her actions. And unfortunately, there's no information about who would have owned these, whether they were commissions or whether Rembrandt painted these for the open market. And I'll just be clear that artists didn't paint for themselves at this time. Artists were, manual laborers, and this is how they made their craft. But I do want to propose that the forceful impact of Rembrandt's paintings may have resulted from some personal associations that the artist made between experiences in his life and the emotional traumas that he projected onto Lucretia at the time of her suicide. So, as I've discussed, in maintaining her honor through death, Lucretia came to be revered as a symbol of chastity, of honor, and faithfulness. And it has been speculated that the 1664 Lucretia may have served as this sort of psychological catharsis for Rembrandt after the death of his companion, Hendrika, who died just the previous year. And so there are some parallels between Lucretia's faithfulness and self-sacrifice and certain indignities that Hendrika suffered because of her commitment to Rembrandt. And so Hendrika Stoffels she entered Rembrandt's household as a nursemaid to his son Titus in around 1649, which was 7 years after the death of his first wife, Titus's mother. However, she ultimately became his mistress, and in 1654 she became pregnant with their daughter, Cornelia. Now, they never married, and this is because this Rembrandt's first wife, Saskia, her will stipulated that if he was ever to remarry, he would have to repay all of the money that he had inherited from her and her family. So he never remarries. But he and Hendrika become common law partners. And because they never married, and because she got pregnant, Hendrika had to appear before the church council for living in sin with Rembrandt. And during this appearance, she had to admit that she had committed the acts of a whore with Rembrandt the painter. And because of that, she was banned from ever receiving communion again. So this was a very public declaration and a very public humiliation for her. So it's very dangerous in my line of work to imagine the mindset of a painter when he composed a scene, moreover to declare it as fact. Nevertheless, it certainly seems possible that we can propose that part of this really essential transformation of the pictorial traditions for portraying this legendary heroine that occurs in these 2 majestic paintings in Washington and Minneapolis may have been related to this event. As I said, Hendrika died in 1663. In the interest of our short time this evening, I have, of course, simplified certain mythologies surrounding Lucretia in the Renaissance and Baroque. As with so many things, it was incredibly complex, and her associations were multifaceted. While she was widely honored in the 17th century for her faithfulness and patriotism, she was also criticized by some Christians for having taken her own life, which was seen as a much greater evil than adultery or shame. And there are certain art historians, one in particular who's written that in Roman terms, Lucretia killed herself not out of guilt, but out of shame, concern for her reputation and for the precedent of pardon that she might set for voluntary adulterers. Christian writers schooled in a religion that placed the highest premium on the innocence of one's personal conscience, regarded such values as excessively concerned with appearances and the opinion of others. Rembrandt, as he so often did, here I think really fuses these two ideas, the pagan world and the Christian world, to create this exceptionally profound image of this psychological moment just prior to Lucretia's fatal decision to thrust the knife into her chest. You see that her raised arms have certain echoes to Christ on the cross. She looks downward toward the weapon of her destruction with an expression of one who, in her decision to commit suicide, is really weighing issues never described by Libby. Right? Rembrandt's Lucretia is not the assured, tragic heroine who is determined her punishment and dies for honor, but she hesitates. At this crucial moment, because of an awareness of a moral dilemma that she's facing. And it may be that Rembrandt drew upon a theatrical tradition to give added poignancy to the moment. With her mouth partially open, she seems to address the dagger as though giving the closing monologue, right, in a tragic drama, which is exactly how Shakespeare did it in his Rape of Lucretia, when he has Lucretia ask, "Poor hand, why progress thou in this decree? Honor thyself to rid me of this shame, for if I die, my honor lives in thee, but if I live, thou livest in my defame." So it has this very theatrical quality to it also. Rembrandt's late paintings, Rembrandt died in 1666, so this is 2 years before he died. Whether biblical accounts or mythological stories, they often take on this sacramental character in the way that the artist confronts the viewer with his images. He has this extremely broad execution, which is to say that you can see all of his brushwork. He has these rich colors, this impressive use of light and dark, the chiaroscuro that really orients the painting, an iconic compositional structure. He really brings to these works this kind of unparalleled forcefulness. And in Lucretia, all of these elements of his late style are evident. Particularly remarkable in this painting is his use of the chiaroscuro, which is the use of the light and dark, to transform an essentially symmetrical and static pose into an incredibly active one. She's not lit from the front, but from the upper left. Right, the light thus strikes her head, her right arm, her shoulder. The dagger blade glistens against her white cuff, and although her left arm is thrown into shadow, her outstretched left hand catches the light. And through these subtle means of emphasis, Rembrandt heightened the drama because he's reinforced, again, this psychological and the physical tension of the scene. After the 17th century, the popularity of Lucretia as a subject for painting really seems to decline, and we don't have this incredible interest in the subject that previously existed. There are certainly some representations, but not the volume that we saw previously, possibly really until the 20th century, and then not so much in the visual arts as much as performing arts, operas like The Rape of Lucretia. And since I know many of you are eagerly anticipating that performance, I won't dwell on the post-17th century because the truth is that's not my area anyway. Still, I hope this evening has given you a little bit to think about when you do go next week to see the opera, or at least complement what will surely be a wonderful show. So thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. So we are happy to take questions.
You stressed how this is a secular story, a political story, and most of these paintings pick one or both of those aspects of the story and emphasize them. The libretto that Britten wrote the opera to has all that, and then it adds this overlay at the end, trying to put a Christian framework around it and somehow deal with you know, what would Christianity make of this
Right.
mortal sin,
Yeah.
suicide? Is there any iconographic history of that in painting?
You don't find it so much, though as I said, you know, here there certainly is that sense. I mean, I do think that he's put her in this cruciform for a reason. So it deals with the idea of Christian morality in that moment. And there were writers, certainly before the Renaissance, but during Renaissance and Baroque eras also, that criticized Lucretia, you know, that this is not a moral woman, that suicide is a far greater, you know, offense than living in shame. So, yeah, I mean, I think you do have artists dealing with that, but it's a little bit more in the literature, I think, than in the visual arts. Though I think Rembrandt is thinking about that too. He's thinking about it too. But you don't see Lucretia, for example, in altarpieces. You wouldn't see this story depicted in a church
Yes.
or in a private devotional context. It's not.
There's no saint with a common story that Christianized the Christian.
Just giving out my geography. Not that's jumping to my mind, but maybe when I'm going to bed tonight. But no, not particularly. I mean, when you see images of martyr saints, they can be the single figure in a sort of side chapel, and we're talking about Catholic context. Protestants don't make religious imagery for devotion. That's one of the central tenets of Protestants. So in a Catholic context, I can't think of one right now, but certainly wouldn't be like a high altar. We're not, martyr saints become subsidiary figures to Christ in terms of Christ in majesty, or the Virgin Mary and the Child, or the Last Judgment. I think those are. Yeah.
Back to the beginning with the Italian Renaissance paintings. The first few you showed us that were on the cassones, or that were essentially meant for women.
Yes.
And then as you went into sort of the second part of that, which was more male-oriented and eroticized, are these two trends that were happening at the same time, or did one give way to the other?
No, absolutely parallel. I mean, we're seeing, I was trying to pick images from different time frames just to kind of move it along. But, this Cranach in 1530 and Botticelli in 1500, I mean, these are not that far apart. So yeah, I mean, we're looking at the treatment of the same story, but within a different viewing context. But yeah, these are absolutely. And I should say these paintings, 1635, 1640s, Rembrandt's alive and working at this time. He personally hasn't painted Lucretia, but we've seen images of Lucretia. The print I showed you was 1609. So these are absolutely all happening around, at the same time. Yeah.
In modern world, if we look at rape, I agree that it has to do with having power over the victim. On the story is that he was perpetrator was invoking power over the husband or Lucretia? What was his story?
I mean, I think I guess what I would say is that that's how we discuss rape today is different than how rape was viewed in the 15th century. And we very much think of it as an act of power today. And certainly, he was exercising his power over her, but the way that Libby tells the story, he was so aroused by her chastity or by her fidelity to her husband and her superiority to these other women that he had to have her. So I don't think we're using a different language, basically. I think I don't know that we psychologize that figure in quite the same way that we would psychologize the act of rape today. And again, as I sort of gave the caveat, rape was defined as as adultery, basically, at the time. And, you know, and so it was taken much less seriously if it was a lower class woman. And oftentimes you would see, if a charge of rape was ever leveled against a man, it was usually because he had promised to marry a woman and then reneged after sleeping with her, and so she was no longer basically pure enough to wed. So it's very different. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you
Okay,
so much.
thank you very